Welcome to UMass Boston, the public university of Boston on the Atlantic Ocean, here on the coast, here on Boston Harbor. Across the hallway we enjoy beautiful views, if you're here in person, of the water, and maybe in the near future more water. We are predicted to be fine here in terms of rising sea levels in the near future at this campus, but it might be a little difficult to get here, and we're going to have to do some adaptation, and there may be some relocation of the neighborhoods of Tinian Beach and our neighbors around here. My name is Bob Chen, the Dean of the School for the Environment here at UMass Boston, and I'm thrilled you could all be with us today for this Living on Earth Book Club event, The Great Displacement, Climate Change, and the Next American Migration. The School for the Environment is proud to teach aspiring environmental leaders to ensure a prosperous and just future for our planet, for our communities, for Boston, and beyond. We bring together smart, ambitious, committed people from across the world and from our city, whose interests vary from urban planning to sustainability to environmental engineering to marine science to management and everything in between and across all of those disciplines. Living on Earth has partnered with the School for the Environment since 2015, but the show has been around and on the airwaves before many of you were born since 1991. The show has been honored with a number of awards, including the Edward R. Murrow Award from the Radio and Television News Directors Association, and Excellence in Science Reporting Award from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Living on Earth airs on 250 stations across the country each week, reaching more than 1 million listeners each month. At the helm of Living on Earth is Steve Curwood, executive producer and host. He's also adjunct faculty in the School for the Environment, and over the years he's been a recipient of a number of awards, including a shared Pulitzer and a Global Green Award for Media Design handed to him by Mikhail Gorbachev. But before we launch into today's interview, which I'm really looking forward to, I'm delighted to introduce UMass Boston's own Chancellor Marcelo Suárez-Orozco for some opening remarks to set the tone. The Chancellor is UMass Boston's 9th Chancellor, and his research focuses on conceptual and empirical problems in the areas of cultural psychology and psychological anthropology, with a focus on the study of mass migration, globalization, and education. He's the author of numerous scholarly essays, award-winning books, edited volumes, and scholarly papers in a range of disciplines and languages in international journals. We share the concern about the existential crisis of our times, climate change, and how it affects all of us, how we will be moving around the local communities as well as the globe. And without further ado, UMass Boston's Chancellor Marcelo Suárez-Orozco.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Steve, for joining us. I'm delighted to join you this afternoon on a conversation that is so urgent and so timely. The Great Displacement, climate change, and the next American migration. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. With climate change and air pollution, the very fabric of life on Earth is at risk. We are creating a new, dangerous phase in Earth's history. A phase that has been termed the Anthropocene by Paul Crutzen, a chemistry Nobel laureate. The term refers to the immense effects of human activity on all aspects of Earth's physical systems. We are dangerously heating up the planet, leaving behind the climate in which civilization first emerged. With accelerating climate change, we face multiple risks: pandemics, new and re-emerging infectious diseases, extreme temperatures, droughts, megastorms, floods, rising sea levels. Unsustainable development, unsustainable consumption contribute to global warming, causing other profound damage, such as air pollution, water pollution, deforestation, massive land degradation, resulting in unprecedented rates of species extinction, never seen in the last 65 million years on planet Earth. Climate change poses a serious threat to human health, with alarming data on increases in heart disease, stroke, lung disease, mental health, infections, cancer. Climate change threatens to exacerbate the current unprecedented flow of displacement of people and increase in human suffering, misery, fueling violence and conflict. The poorest of the planet, who still mostly depend on 19th century technologies to meet basic needs, are bearing a large part of the damage caused by the economic activities of rich countries. The top billion people on Earth, roughly Europe and North America, are creating the pollution, the shocks of which have been absorbed by the bottom 4 billion people on Earth, people that have zero connection with the polluting of our living systems. Climate change and geophysical catastrophes are increasing morbidity and mortality. They disrupt the production and distribution of goods and services, decrease agricultural yields, forcibly displace millions of human beings, as our conversation with Jake will illuminate. Extreme weather patterns, high-intensity cyclones, monsoons, floods, droughts, hurricanes, heat waves, forest fires are increasingly the new drivers of mass migration the world over. In the first 2 decades of our century, most new displacements are occurring in low and middle-income countries, and as a result of large-scale weather events. By 2022, over 60 million people were forcibly displaced. In 2021, most forced displacements, 80%, were the result of tropical storms and flooding in East and South Asia. The 5 countries with the highest numbers of internal displacements in 2021 due to disasters, I passed around the most recent data, are China, the Philippines, India, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Vietnam. While China, India, and the Philippines have the highest absolute number, it is the small island states that suffer disproportionately once population size is taken into account. Slow onset disasters, existing vulnerabilities, war and terror continue to converge into explosive tipping points for human displacements. In 2021, documented displacements due to environmental factors took place in 59 countries in all regions of the world. Over the last decade, well over 200 million people were forcibly displaced. The evidence is everywhere. In the continent where I come from, South America, in Peru, a receding glacier high in the Cordillera Blanca, the White Andes, that's what Cordillera Blanca means, range has created an unstable lagoon that is ready to trigger massive avalanches and wipe an entire city in Huaraz, Peru, the valley below. A Peruvian farmer there is pursuing an unprecedented lawsuit against German interests, a German company linking greenhouse emissions of its power plants to the rapidly melting of the glacier. Around the world, across the world, in Pakistan, epic flooding caused by torrential monsoon rainfall 10 times higher than normal destroyed livelihoods and killed more than 1,000 people. Cyclone Freddy, which broke records for the longest lasting storm of its kind, devastated Mozambique and Madagascar during the last year. Steve just came back from California. A hurricane landed on Northern or Southern California? Both. This is everywhere. There's no place to hide. The through line of these and so many other contexts is unfairness, inequality. Those least responsible for climate change are forced to cope with its worst impact. As the IPCC report earlier this week notes, quote, almost half the world's population lives in regions that are highly vulnerable to climate change. In the last decade, deaths from floods, droughts, and storms were 15 times higher in highly vulnerable regions of the world. Our own UMass Boston alumna, the former EPA administrator, Gina McCarthy, observed, I think during our convocation address, Peter will correct me if I'm wrong, we can't fix the planet and leave the most impacted communities behind. Climate change mitigation and environmental justice are two sides of the same coin. End of quote. That is exactly the point. And it raises the existential question addressed by Jake Bittle's new, urgent book. What does it mean in a phenomenology of experience, not as geologic, geophysical impacts? What does it mean in the phenomenology of experience of human beings endeavoring to cope with climate change at the individual level for people who experience the impacts of climate change day in and day out? Of course, we can and we will, in the starkest language, most urgent language, continue to reference and publicize the broad geophysical impacts of climate change. We can continue to note the risks climate change poses to human health. We can continue to cite the role of unsustainable development, unsustainable consumption in causing pollution, deforestation, land degradation, species extinction. We will continue to point out how extreme weather patterns are behind the catastrophic migrations of the 21st century. But until we understand what this means in the lives of individuals having to cope with these catastrophic formations, it's easy to dismiss the urgency. It is in Jake's stories that we get what the great William James, who invented American psychology across the river, what the great William James called experience near. This is the ethnography of climate displacement, of what happens when people accept that they can no longer live in their communities, when histories, memories are lost. UMass Boston is under the leadership of Bob Chang, so many others, Rebecca, so many others, Professor Paul Kirshen, so many others are at the forefront of basic research, translational research, applied research in the Sustainable Solutions Lab, where we are studying the relationships between racial and ethnic inequality and climate interventions. Remember, the broad data that the top billion have a devastating impact on the bottom 4 billion people on Earth, that mimics what is unfolding in wealthy countries the world over. It is the poor. It is the marginalized. It is the underserved. It's the communities of color. It's the native communities that are absorbing the most shocks flowing from unchecked climate change. Extraordinary research, too much for me to cover all of it here, but keep up the good work in terms of health impacts, preparedness, responses, adaptability, resiliency. We need to decarbonate the atmosphere, but we also, this is an all hands on deck. This is a chew and walk moment. We need to deploy all of the adaptability and resilience tools in the toolbox to get in front of what we're facing. Among the findings of the research is that residents in communities of color here in our own Commonwealth and around our country acknowledge that their socioeconomic inequalities that define their lives limit their ability to prepare, to adapt to the impacts of climate change. All of this, and this is where I think Jake's work is so important, underscore how we now live in an ever more interconnected, miniaturized, and fragile world where the here and the there are entirely blurred as basic categories of understanding. Vulnerable local communities are everywhere today. There is no place to hide. I think Gutierrez said it best on Monday. I think he said, this is your, remember the movie, Houston, we have a problem. Earth, we have a problem, is how he framed, the Secretary General, how he framed the release of the report on Monday. Earth, we have a problem, and it's everywhere. It's so important to have the conversations we're about to have. I'm so grateful to Steve, to Jake, for bringing the kind of first-hand knowledge, the kind of ethnographic narrative data of an ethnography that should have never been written, the ethnography of catastrophic climate change. Thank you, Jake. Steve Curwood, adjunct faculty in the School for the Environment, our host, the host of Living on Earth. Please, it's yours.
Thank you, Chancellor. Well done. And Jake, welcome to the podium here. So, the Chancellor was talking before we began about speaking on this topic more than a decade ago, and what climate disruption was going to do. We have a microphone problem. Oh, yes. Sorry. Is it radios and webinars use microphones? Is that what this technology? Oh, okay. Just was unsure. As we were getting ready, the Chancellor was talking about a speech he gave more than a decade ago on climate disruption and migration. And I found myself saying to him, don't you wish you were wrong? Don't you wish we'd gotten this, that the concern about climate disruption and what's going on was overblown, as so many people from certain industrial and financial interests have said? Sadly, we were wrong on the lower impact side. This is a tsunami of disruption that's coming at us. And Jake Bittle here, the book, if you haven't caught on by now, is called The Great Displacement: Climate Change and the Next American Migration. I want mitigation, actually. I really want mitigation. And Jake is an accomplished journalist. Right now he's with Grist. You've written for The Guardian, The Times, Harper's. And let me just say, there are a lot of really important books that aren't so accessible. This one is really easy to read. I can tell, Jake, that you and your editors worked and worked and worked and worked and worked to get it so that there's a smooth narrative arc to every chapter. There's a smooth discussion of the arguments involved. There, you take a good look at things that we know and things that we maybe are going to find out, so that when you sit down with your copy of this, briefly, this book is structured with telling the overall story in an introduction and with some suggestions at the end as to how to deal with this. But inside are these stories of people who have been suddenly or slowly disrupted by this process. And so whether you're in a fire in California, Santa Rosa, or whatever, and everything that you and your family have built is gone, and your neighborhood is gone, and you don't even have to be poor, because if you're middle class, you know, our financial system, we bank a lot of money on mortgages and homes in the middle class. And when one of these things comes through, so fires, floods, fast floods, Houston. How about slow floods, Norfolk, Virginia, where it's become very difficult for people to buy and sell their homes because at the end of the day, the rising sea level. Enough talk from me, Jake. How did you get into this? What prompted you to write such a volume?
So before I wrote about climate change, I mostly wrote about housing. This is okay? Yeah. You guys can hear me? Okay. I mostly wrote about housing, and I had learned about a federal government program in Houston where the government paid people to leave their homes, and they knocked down homes that were perennially flooding. You know, they'd flood 10, 12 times in as many years. And I went to Houston to write a magazine article about it, and I walked around these neighborhoods that had been completely emptied out, you know, in the middle of a relatively dense city. And I was mostly writing about the people who had hung on and, you know, not participated in the program and were staying in these empty areas. But during the course of writing that article, I sort of started to wonder, where did all the people who took the money end up? And almost nobody could tell me. FEMA couldn't tell me, Houston couldn't tell me, the neighbors couldn't tell me. Maybe there was one academic who had tried to find it out. And that was the seed for the book, was I used the federal database of buyouts, and then I used the white pages to find all the people who had lived in these homes before. And I ended up with maybe 10 or 12 times as much material as I was able to use in the article. And it quickly became clear to me that it wasn't a problem that was localized to Houston. It wasn't a phenomenon that was specific to flooding. It was a sort of very unremarked upon or poorly understood movement that was going on after these disasters all over the country. And I thought, okay, well, if you look at the people who move, who are induced to move by the government or by natural disasters as a class or a group of people, what does that look like? And that was kind of the initial idea for the project.
Wow. I neglected to mention at the outset here that thanks to the generosity of the publisher, we have some 20 signed copies of Jake's book. And if you donate $75 or more today, because we can't do these free live events without support. So this is an opportunity to get a terrific volume and help us. And also, in this process, we're going to be taking questions from folks who are here and also online. Our producer, Jenny Doring, and Louis Mallison helping her, will help curate those. And Jake, I got two questions about the Houston story. First one is, what did the people who stayed think? If they saw this devastation, why did they stay?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I think there were sort of two reasons. One was that people were really attached to the place that they had, raised their children or where they themselves had grown up. And they just didn't want to leave. They had insurance, so they were able to rebuild after a flood. And they just thought, well, I don't want to leave. There's not really anywhere else I can go that's as affordable as this neighborhood. And then others, they really liked the fact that suddenly their backyard was now 20 times larger than it had been before. Every other house in their street was gone. I think for a lot of us who say this is not so pleasant, but for some people, with kids who like playing football or something, they say, wow, this is great, And I think it really brought home for me that there's a lot of, it's a very messy topic, movement decisions and migration. People don't really act always in the ways that we expect them to. So there was some attachment at a psychological or emotional level, and then for some people it was convenient to live with that risk, which is, I thought, fascinating.
And so the other question is, what's the role of insurance in these disasters, whether it's the floods in Houston or the fires or the storms that have taken out so many places from North Carolina to parts of Florida? What's the role that insurance is playing in that?
Yeah, insurance is it's the single deciding factor in usually whether somebody can stay or leave, right? So it's getting quite expensive in most of these places for fires and floods. It's probably the main way that people are feeling the increased risk of climate change, that as the disasters get more expensive, the insurers have to charge more money for people to keep maintaining the same policies. But really, if you have sufficient insurance or you have a good insurance policy, you tend to be able to rebuild decently fast. Often it takes quite a long time because you have to go to war with the company to get the payout. But you can make it back eventually. And if you're a renter who doesn't have sufficient insurance, which is usually the case, or if you purchased a policy that was too small, you're going to end up being unable to build a structure that's the same size as the one that you were living in before. And almost all those people, sort of on the lower economic end of homeownership and then tenants, those are the ones who were the least able to hold on to the places that they lived. So insurance is like the main way that we hold on to the existing property that could be destroyed in disaster, and that is getting more and more expensive. It's a serious financial burden for people at this point.
Yeah, talk to me about insurance in a place like Norfolk, Virginia, say.
Yeah, so most people there, for flood insurance, they purchase a policy from a federal government program, because most private companies don't offer it because it's not profitable. But those policies are getting extraordinarily expensive. Under some new rules that the federal government has rolled out, I spoke to several families who are paying upwards of $13,000 a year for policies. That's more than 300 times what it was a couple years ago, and there's not really a cap on that, so it can just keep going up over and over again as the cost of flooding gets bigger and bigger every year. And I think it's interesting because what that number is trying to communicate is that, you know, one day the home will be potentially permanently underwater. So its value is essentially nil, and the cost of protecting it is infinity. So that number, which is impossible for families to pay, is sort of communicating like the financial system of homeownership can't sustain you living here. But for the people in that position, it just feels like a massive, you know, financial burden, and often leads to them having to leave.
So I know you didn't start as a social psychologist, but what is in the human mind that gets a signal that it's like more than $1,000 a month to pay for insurance for the place, which probably the mortgage payment itself
It's much less than that in most
could be
cases.
less than that
Yeah.
in many of these places.
Yeah.
And so why do people persist in a situation like this?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that I never really found a satisfactory answer to. It seems to be different for each person, but you know, in places like New Orleans, for instance, coastal Louisiana, people really have a really, really strong attachment to the place that they're from. And in a lot of cases, there just isn't another part of the country or indeed the world that is similar. And everyone they know lives there, that's where they work, that's where they grew up, and they just don't want to leave until they absolutely have to. The other side of it, though, is that if you have a $13,000 per year insurance premium, it's really hard to find somebody to buy your house if you want to sell it. So there's a separate piece where the homes become albatrosses for people. You know, they just can't get out from underneath their mortgage. And that's a place where it seems like the only realistic solution is for the government to intervene, because the market has just completely broken down. So yeah, you either have people who are in love or they're trapped, you know, and sometimes they're both.
So if you do the math, I think you did, like a third of us live in coastal areas. We have rising sea levels. We have storms that are coming. Insurance is increasingly hard to get in these places. At what point will we as a society, the individuals in our society, say, oops, we need to leave here while we can still sell our houses for something? And then, of course, when that happens, when everybody shows up at the bank to take out their deposits like we saw on these bank runs on the
Yeah.
West Coast, I mean, the system collapses.
Yeah, it could potentially look like that. There's not a lot of precedent for this, right? Because in previous asset bubbles, there's always the hope that, you know, the values will increase again one day, right? Like in Las Vegas after the 2008 financial crisis, many of those homes which lost 2/3 of their value are now back up to where they were. But in coastal areas, you're not going to see those values go back up, because the homes will be literally underwater, you know, on a few decade timeline. I think it's what you'll see is a lot of people who are stuck. You know, they are basically have no option but to sort of plead at a political level for what in the book, you know, I think I described fairly as a bailout. It's not their fault for living there, but the only solution realistically is for the government, you know, which doesn't have a stake in it, to pump money in to get people out of their homes. And the government, I think, has to act as a backstop in the same way that the Federal Reserve does for banks. You know, FEMA or whichever branch you prefer can act as a backstop for the housing market and just say, look, this ended really badly and it's going to be very expensive, but we have to grease the wheels so people can get out, because otherwise there's not really another party that's going to, I mean, certainly JP Morgan Chase, you know, they're not even the biggest homeland, they're not interested in bailing people out, because it's just a pure financial loss. And at some point somebody has to take the hit for that. And it's not exactly clear to me when that will happen, but mathematically, you know, at some point in the next 50 years or so, you would think that in many of these places like Norfolk, Miami, there's going to be some kind of reckoning. It could happen quite fast.
Yeah, talk to us more about Norfolk. And one of the aspects of the story that you tell is that the government, in fact, can't help everybody. They very, very selectively help people with solutions.
Right, yeah. So FEMA can only spend a certain proportion of its budget each year on the kind of long-term solutions, you know, elevating homes, raising roads, fixing storm drains, you know, installing like seawalls or bulkheads like the one that's on the the edge of the point here. That's they maybe spend a few $billion a year on that, and they have a lot of money, but states and cities can't really do it on their own. It's just really hard for a state like Virginia or a city like Norfolk to finance these giant infrastructure improvements. Like for instance, in Norfolk and in several other cities along the coast, they're considering building essentially giant gates to keep out hurricane storm surge, and that's not something that a city government can afford. So you end up with, basically one game in town, the federal government, and they're limited in what they think they can spend. So a city, which takes the money, has to make really tough decisions about, okay, we have $10 million this year, do we spend it in this neighborhood or in that neighborhood? And what criteria should we even use to make that decision, right? So I think in any city, Boston, Norfolk, there's probably places that are of immensely high economic and cultural value, and they're very vulnerable. There's places that are of extremely disadvantaged communities that are also very vulnerable. And it's really up to the local leaders to figure out, okay, well, what's our best bet here? And that ends really badly in a lot of cases, because we got to protect our tax base. But in any case, there's such a shortage of money for this that local leaders are making really, really tough decisions. And in the meantime, the underserved areas, the infrastructure just continues to decay. Right, and so you end up with, like in Norfolk, one of my favorite images is like in one of these neighborhoods, at high tide, the water pools up in the streets and fish, when it recedes out, there's these puddles that get left behind and fish will literally swim around on the street. So you can see a car go by and right where the tire goes through the puddle, there's all these tiny fish swimming around. And, it smells awful and it's really, really terrible to live with, and there's just not a dollar for everybody to fix it.
So, at the end of the day, it seems like we're in a lot of trouble because this is something that you can't fix on a piecemeal basis. I mean, we talk about building resilience in communities, but as you point out in Norfolk and so many other places, can't afford to have everybody be resilient, can't afford to have a flood wall, can't afford to move people from away from the fires. Or you wrote about the water crisis in the Southwest and what happens as the water rights start to vanish for people built their houses based on the fact that they could get water or been in agriculture. So what did you find in the way of solutions?
Yeah,
to this?
They are sometimes hard to come by. I mean, I think it's worth putting in perspective, right, that we often talk about a wartime mobilization to fight climate change, right, an all-hands-on-deck thing, as the Chancellor said. And you definitely need one of those just in order to transition away from fossil fuels, right, to do the first step of solving the problem. Then you probably need a second wartime mobilization, an almost unprecedented infrastructure build-out to give the barest degree of protection to coastal cities, to places that are really vulnerable to wildfire, to fix the really, really broken water system, to restore all these rivers that have, completely vanished. And even that level of investment probably won't be sufficient to save everybody on the timeline that, it would take to actually roll all this stuff out. So then you have this third thing, and I think that this is it's kind of cold comfort as a solution, but I think it's the direction that we need to go in, of figuring out what is the just and fair way to move people who don't want, for whom there's no option and there's no ability to save them by building infrastructure. How do you get them out in a fair way? And how do you, debuild or unconstruct the places that we've built that are too risky to continue living in? And that is, the ultimate, it's the most cost-effective and it's the most permanent solution to this kind of stuff, but it's incredibly traumatic for the people involved, and it's very difficult to execute well. But I think eventually you have to look at what is called managed retreat in climate adaptation terms. You have to move back from the worst affected places, and we don't know how to do that well, but we have to figure it out.
Because as you pointed out earlier, the people who have a lot of economic resources compared to other folks tend to dictate what that managed retreat is all about and what kind of gets protected. So the subtitle of your book includes this American migration, the next American migration. Where are people going? Both over the short term, like when a town gets burned out, when the neighborhood gets burned out, or the region gets burned out, or you can't grow your crops, or you can't buy and sell your houses. Where are people going if they figure out they have to leave?
Yeah. In the short term, they mostly go, I think, the shortest possible distance that they can, right? A lot of times they end up moving into another place that's just as vulnerable, or they move to the closest city where they can find cheap housing, right? So sometimes they'll move from a rural area to a nearby city, or, they'll just move down the street, they'll live with their family, anything to maintain the social ties that they already have. And then on a longer term, it seems like you'd see a sort of a still relatively regionally focused migration, right? So people from Miami could go to Orlando, people from New Orleans might end up in Dallas. You're not seeing a march north or a movement west on the scale of the Dust Bowl, but you are seeing people start to say, okay, well, there's certain areas, often rural areas that are extremely high risk and don't have enough money to keep up with the pace of disaster, and we've kind of got to get out of those places, right? And then so the third episode, I suppose, is on the 50 to 100-year timeline. Certain places like Phoenix, Miami, they may become so hot and so battered that they sort of stop growing at the rate that they have been. And then you may see other places, that heretofore have not seen a lot of growth in the past decades. They may start to be the sort of site of that future growth. So I think what's important to emphasize is it doesn't necessarily need to involve people from the South picking up their things and moving north. It's just that the locus of investment and growth will gradually shift to the north, I think. But that's still a ways off, I think.
Okay, but tell us where people might be going in the north, because here we
Right,
are
yes,
in the north.
Indeed, yeah.
Are they coming here? Are they going to Detroit and Cleveland, or
It's certainly possible.
Minneapolis? Where are they going?
I mean, if you look at a map and you sort of assess on paper what are the places with the least vulnerability to hurricanes, storm surge, sea level rise, wildfires, drought, etc., you end up with a list of cities mostly in the upper Midwest, right? Cincinnati is often put forward as a potential place because it could house twice the number of people that it currently does. It has an abundant supply of fresh water. Buffalo, for all its many weather issues, is often said to be like one of the most resilient places to climate change. I think that the fate of coastal cities like Boston, whether they become moving sites for people, really depends a lot on how much we spend on ensuring that they're resilient to the biggest disasters, right? So there's a version of Boston where there's a giant green ring around the waterfront, and it's really, really difficult to imagine a storm big enough to flood the city. That's definitely possible, but it's sort of up in the air, I think. But there are places that are sort of ready-made for this, right? Duluth, Minnesota, Chicago to a certain extent, that those may be the places where if you were making a hypothetical decision about where to put your money, you might end up there, right? But that doesn't imply that people will make such rational decisions. It's just like, on paper, they look good, right? Right. Even though people who live there are like, this is really cold, you don't want to wait 50 years before you show up.
Well, I don't know. There are places like Detroit that have a lot of underused
right.
infrastructure, like you said, or the Cincinnatis or the Pittsburghs of the world or whatever.
Yeah, in Detroit, for instance, after the crash, they had a program where they would give people money to come. They really did their best to reinvest in the city. They really wanted people to move there, right? And that program, was only a success to a small degree. But I think it's the kind of thing where if in 50 years a lot of the South looks, like it's going to be uninhabitable each summer because of heat, and they try it again, then maybe you see companies and white-collar workers saying, okay, actually, maybe that sounds like a better idea than we thought, right? But it can take a while, and I think the rest of the country has to look even worse than it does now before people would make that decision. Because everybody wants to live in Phoenix. I'm from Florida. Everybody wants to live in Florida, and that may not change for, a few decades, right, until you start to see some really devastating and chronic events.
And big insurance bills.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
So, we've seen for a number of years, and you didn't write so much about this, you allude to this, people, well, you have a short section on this, people had to come from leave Central America because it is dysfunctional now to farm in the traditional way, and this has really pushed a lot of migrants north towards the United States, and I guess Canada is opening its doors now. They said they took in 100,000 more people last year, and they expect to double their population over the next couple of decades. So, but one of the things that's happened with the displacement by climate disruption from Central America is that our political system has not been able to deal very well with this at all. I mean, we still don't have a solution for immigration in this country right now, international immigration. So what things did you observe? What advice might you have based on your work as to what the situation of frankly, climate refugees from Central America coming to the United States, what that tells us about what we need to do here?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have language, really, it seems like, to talk about the immigration problem in terms of climate change, even though, as you say, it's an increasing driver of people, showing up at the border and claiming asylum, right? I think, the main takeaway is that if the last few decades are any indication, there's just not going to be an effective congressional reform to immigration law. And if the goal is to get more people into the United States and to rehouse people who are being displaced by climate change, it just doesn't seem like it's effective or wise to hold out hope that, Congress could come together and pass some kind of law that would open up, immigration. If anything, it would be the opposite. There are, however, some levers that the president could pull. There's a program called Temporary Protected Status, which has been used, for instance, for refugees from Haiti. When there's a disaster, the executive branch has pretty wide authority to grant, a waiver basically on a lot of immigration restrictions to people who are suffering from a really, really intense and sudden disaster, right, like an earthquake or a hurricane. It's not really going to help people who are suffering from famine, or at least it's never been tried in that way, for these sort of slower disasters like sea level rise. But the law is relatively robust, right? And so I think that it would be a matter of really trying to flex some of this executive muscle that we really haven't tried to use before. But as long as you frame the conversation about climate refugees in terms of American immigration law and immigration enforcement, I really don't think it's going anywhere because the politics around it are just abysmal. There's just been almost no movement on it in decades, and it doesn't seem like that's going to change.
You reveal in your book that one of the major cause of truly regional migration isn't necessarily that sudden weather event, the flood, or the hurricane, even the fire, but the gradual increase in temperature that is just relentless. It goes up by tenths of a degree, but it keeps going up. Why is that?
I think that it's because of the way that people experience risk, right? I think that, the chances that my town is going to get hit by a hurricane each year, they're always going to be relatively low. It's never going to be 100%, right? And any amount of financial stress, can always be overcome, or you can always kind of say, okay, well, maybe this flood insurance payment is too high in this home, but what if I move to higher ground, just a couple miles away, right, and get a discount on my premium? But I think the idea that every summer you're going to face lethal temperatures, right? There's health impacts. It's extremely dangerous to raise children in that kind of weather. I think that is what's going to make people make the psychological decision to make an elective movement away from these areas and away from the regions as a whole, right? Because of the way that we've built our cities and, because of the way we built against rivers and mountains, there's always a place that's more resilient to flooding or fire than, a place 10 miles away. But heat is it's an atmospheric phenomenon. It's not something you can avoid just by moving a couple miles away. You have to move to a place that's more temperate. And even then, you're not totally out of danger. So I think that's the kind of thing it's not really a financial burden. People won't experience it financially. It's not even necessarily, like something that's going to damage their property. It's just the feeling of, okay, as long as I live here, I'm going to have to deal with this. That's going to change a lot of people's minds, I think, especially when you look into the health impacts on older people and very young people.
And what about businesses? I mean, business and industry is going to have to migrate.
Right, certainly.
If you're doing things outside.
Right. I mean, look at, San Francisco, for instance. A lot of tech companies have said, our workers don't want to come to work. They don't want to live here because they're concerned about crime. They're concerned about quality of life. And it turned into a hair-pulling moment for the industry. It's not that hard to imagine, all the tech companies, for instance, that are being headquartered in Austin right now, or a lot of them have moved to Miami, it's not that hard to imagine them saying, uh-oh, our workers don't want to live here because it's far too hot. We have to make sure that we move our offices somewhere else so that we can attract talent. It's not happening yet, but it's far from implausible.
We have a couple of questions here, Jay.
Oh, great.
Stacy's online. He or she says, why are people even allowed to build or rebuild in flood zones?
Because we, as a country, have been very, very hesitant about discouraging that, because as soon as you say you can't rebuild here, then the value of the existing property goes down quite a bit, right? So I think that, for instance, a couple years ago, Congress tried to raise insurance rates for flood insurance by quite a bit in 2012. And this was essentially the same thing as saying you can't rebuild here, because once the insurance premiums hit that level, they were going to be almost unaffordable for any homeowner except the wealthiest. And the homeowners in the Jersey Shore, they were completely incensed. There was like an unprecedented political opposition to an issue that honestly few people even understand, right? And it was like there was a grassroots movement against this. And Congress rolled it back, because I think in this country we're so concerned about protecting property values. It's the main lever of middle class wealth accumulation is an investment in a house. That there's a lot of pushback when you to say, well, you can't do this, right? A local government could say that tomorrow. Boston could say, there'd probably be a lawsuit, but they could say, you're not allowed to build within a mile of the shoreline. And some people have tried to do this, right? But it's like putting a scarlet letter on the property, on the front door. And that's going to destroy a lot of people's property values. And I think policymakers are really, really scared of that. And they don't think that there's a way to make up that value that the homeowner will lose. Yeah.
So to what extent does the solution lie in paying a lot more attention to how ecological systems work? So, for example, we have a lot of homes in coastal areas that Mother Nature would use, even without climate disruption, to occasionally flood or render relatively uninhabitable. Yeah. Or people build very close to forests,
right,
that every 50 or 100 years for its own ecology would want to burn. And yet, our development patterns almost seem contrary to what nature would have us do. How can we bring nature into the equation, or maybe how, to what extent is it too late to try to consider nature?
It's absolutely not too late. For instance, like the peninsula that we're on, it's mostly made out of reclaimed land, right? It's a square. If you look at it, it didn't look like that 200 years ago. It was like this jaggedy thing, and they built it out. And we've done that in so many places for almost every kind of building environment, right? And I think that there's a lot of, it's very expensive, and oftentimes it comes into conflict with people who already live there. But it's not too late at all to sort of make room for water, or to, instead of putting up a flood wall, you let water flow, and, it's called the bypass or diversion. You can let a river flow naturally, past property, instead of trying to dam it up and make sure it doesn't flood the house. In fire-prone areas, they've done a lot of good work in clearing a lot of the brush that shouldn't have been able to accumulate, or in moving back from the wildland-urban interface. Certainly the water systems of the West that have been extreme, they've dammed, they're managed, with excessive strictness. They've allowed some of those rivers to resume their natural flow. This stuff really, really works. And in fact, it's a lot cheaper than building a wall and hoping that the water doesn't come over it, because one day it's going to, and then you have quite a bit of money that you have to spend. I think that it's just not the way that this country has approached building and has approached expansion over the last 100 years. And for a lot of people who are, civil engineers, or who are in charge of planning development of cities, it's completely antithetical to the way that they've been taught to, sustain and induce economic growth. But it's exactly what we have to do. And I don't think it's too late at all, right? As long as you're willing to spend and you're willing to help people get back on their feet if you need to, get them out of the way, then you can definitely find room for water or fire to go. It's been done.
By the way, how do we compare to the affluent European countries in terms of managing these risks?
I think that there's definitely some issues there. In fact, this is a really interesting thing that I didn't get to touch on in the book, but you can sort of see that in the 20th century, a lot of urban planners and developers from Europe to India to Southeast Asia, they sort of all attended the United States school of how to manage water. But in the Netherlands, for instance, like they had a few decades ago just massive problems with water inundation, storm surge risk, and they did something completely different than what we did. Instead of building a wall, they've done this sort of channel and gate system where the water has room to move through a lot of islands, and this is a highly vulnerable society that like this peninsula is mostly built on reclaimed land. And they've managed to find a way to move water around and to give it space. And they've managed to reduce, flood damages by a shocking amount, 80 or 90% in some places in terms of the overall annual cost. So there are definitely better solutions out there, although, in a lot of industrialized societies, a lot of the strategies are more or less the same.
We have a question from Julie, who's online. Socialist democracies and dictatorships seem better positioned to manage climate migration top-down. How can we pull this off in the relatively libertarian system we have here in the United States?
And that's a tough one, and I sort of don't feel like any country is doing all that good of a job. I mean, Europe tried really hard after the 2015 refugee crisis. Merkel got on TV and said, we can do this, right? But it's also been really, really difficult, even with very generous social safety nets there, for them to house everyone. But I do think that the United States, because of the phenomenon that Julie pointed to, is really uniquely, there's a big challenge here because we don't see housing as something that the government should really be involved in, right? It hasn't been involved in it for decades. The, Section 8, the voucher program, for instance, is funded at a quarter of entitlement. 1 in every 4 people who are eligible for it in the U.S. can get a housing voucher. We just don't do this, and I think it's really hard to imagine dealing with an influx of people and making sure that they're all well off, and making sure all the people who are already here well off, unless the government were to take a more active role in providing housing to people, and unless you started to think of housing as an entitlement rather than something that, it's really lucky if you can afford, and you have to be in like the top 10% of income distribution in a major city in order for it to be anything close to affordable. I mean, that's not a situation that's friendly to a big influx of people from other countries. So I think that's right, that fundamentally the U.S. market-driven approach to housing provision is not well set up to this, and other countries with more robust safety nets, in theory at least, are a little better positioned.
Well, yeah, that's right. Speaking of the housing situation, I mean, for less affluent people, it's almost an anti-ecology system that puts them at greater risk with climate disruption. Public housing, huge brick monoliths and concrete jungles that tend to be, 10 degrees hotter at night in the summer than the areas around them that happen to have trees.
Yeah.
I mean, what is it in our mentality that we have kind of an anti-climate and ecological resilience program for low-income people?
I think in a lot of major cities, the main reason is that it's extremely cheap. And that public housing, it was built in theory, these were these towers in the park that were supposed to be ideal living situations. In the beginning, they were mostly designed for white residents. But I think that because of the segregation of those projects, the maintenance just went out the window. There was no, there was no focus on quality of life. The drainage systems are inferior. They can't handle stormwater distribution. They don't bother to plant trees, right? So I think it's mostly a cost-saving thing. And I think that, wealthier neighborhoods where there's enough political clout to say, look, we'd really like some trees. Look, these drains are clogged. Can you please fix it? They've been able to, and not in every case, but in a lot of cases, they've been able to keep up a little better with the changing weather patterns than, places where cities don't really invest very much money at all.
I have to ask you this question
Sure.
because we're running out of time for this portion of our program. This came up in the editorial meeting before this session. Jake Bittle, what gives you hope? Climate change is intensifying. The wealth gap is increasing. What keeps you optimistic? You have a smile on your face here today.
Because I'm always terrified of this question. I do think that 5 or 6 years ago, the last time that the UN did a big round of reports on climate change, there was not any reason, I don't think, for optimism, right? And I think now if you look at the way that the energy system has started to shift, the just unprecedented and really, really, I think, not predicted explosion of solar power. Coal has been retired far faster than I think most people thought the market would retire it. There's a lot of reason to believe that society can move on a lot of these really, really tough, sticky decarbonization issues. Whereas I think in 2016 and 2017, at the dawn of the Trump era, it seemed like there was just not going to be any progress whatsoever. And I think that for a lot of people in the field, slow and kind of hesitant progress is a world better than no progress whatsoever. You're laughing.
Well, I mean, how fast is this freight train called climate disruption coming down the tracks on us? And then we're standing there.
We don't know. I mean, this is the problem, is that it always seems to go a little faster than you thought, and because it's not really linear, right? Like, sea level rise doesn't occur at a linear rate. The melting of the glaciers there's these distinct moments that a glacier will calve and the future rise will go much higher than we thought. The Amazon is no longer a carbon sink. Now it emits carbon. There's definitely reasons to be really, really scared. But I do think that there's a pliability, and at least in the power grid, that I was really surprised by. And then I think I'll do one that maybe is more convincing. Right? I think that a lot of people, I think a lot of the government, the federal government, and a lot of local governments are really starting to rethink the, pro-growth, pro-development, sort of anti-nature mentality that ended us up in this situation. Like, for instance, on the Klamath River, which runs through Oregon and California, the federal government ordered the removal of 4 hydroelectric dams that all but destroyed the ecology of the river. They massacred a salmon population that hasn't been able to return upriver in almost a century now. And after 20 years of campaigning by indigenous organizers, those dams, they are going to be removed this year. There's no more debating about it, and that ecosystem will be restored. I think that this is something that, again, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I don't think it would have been even conceivable. But I think that when people look at what industrial society has done to the world, they start to sort of see in individual places, individual pieces of infrastructure, they start to see that global problem sort of instantiated in that one dam or in that one road. And I think that there's people who have started to change their minds on this, It's not necessarily like going to convince you that we're all going to be fine, but I do think that it's surprising. It was surprising to me, that the dam was going to come down. And I think that that's meaningful, right? Like, people can change their minds on this, and then eventually things can catch up. It takes a long time, though. It's happening too slow, too late. But, it's not like everybody is 100% intransigent forever. And that's the best answer that I could give you. But that's what gives me hope, yeah.
Now, you don't have to answer this question, but as I understand it, you live in New York City.
That's right.
Superstorm Sandy created an island of lower Manhattan. If the tides had been different, it would have been an issue for us here in Boston. So as sea level rise and storms increase, New York and Boston maybe aren't the most well-positioned places to deal. So you can tell us, after all this research, where would you move to deal with the threats of climate disruption?
The second floor of my apartment building. No, it's really tough, and I think, like I said earlier, the future of a lot of really, really wealthy coastal cities really depends on what kind of investments they choose to make. But I have Canadian citizenship, and my family's originally from Toronto, and I've always really liked it there, and that seems like one of the places that, if I had to pick, where I'd want to live in 100 years, assuming some of the worser case scenarios, Toronto seems like a pretty good bet.
All that water, a fifth of the world's surface fresh water is right there on the doorstep.
That's correct, and I can tell you from experience, having gone there around Christmas time, that it's not in danger of being too hot anytime soon, unless things go really, really awry. That's the closest I can give to an answer. And I'm kind of kidding, but there's some on paper reasoning there as well.
So
I haven't got that one before. That's a good one.
I'm sure people have asked you.
Yeah.
Well, then that prompts another question. Aside from those two questions, what do people want to ask you most about after they have either thought about your book or even read it?
That's I think it's where people are going to move and how long before. I think the how long question is a really psychologically tempting one, and it's the one where the answer truly is, we don't know. You know, it could be, you know, for some of the places like that are at risk from hurricanes or wildfires, it could be next year, it could be in 20 years. There's just so much variability. And I think the what's next question is also on a lot of people's minds, and it's difficult to answer as well. Like, after 5 years of drought in California, the water system just completely stressed to the point of breaking. You know, now the Central Valley, a lake that hasn't been there in 200 years, it's reappeared, you know, because there's just so much water and so much melting snow. And I think that, you know, as a reporter, like, you know, what's next is a really tempting question because there's a lot of data out there, there's a lot of people trying to predict things, and I think the answer is we just don't know. You know, we don't know what, and we don't know how bad, and we kind of have to learn to live with that uncertainty.
With that, let's just wrap up by saying that it's listeners, it's folks like you, who help sustain the Living on Earth program and these live events. So if you can and you want to, please consider sending a donation to us at loe.org. And the first 20 people who give $75 or more today will receive a signed copy of Jake's book. And we have him right here. We can twist his arm to get these things signed. So thank you all, and we look forward to having you at the next Living on Earth live stream. Thank you all. We look forward to having you at the next Living on Earth Book Club event live stream. Bye for now.
Thanks so much.
Okay, so the show's not over for those of you who are here. So I want to welcome Rebecca Hurst. She's director of the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass to come up to the stage, and you have some people you're going to bring up too, so that you can have some questions. Have at it with our guest and with comments and with questions.
Awesome.
Should I get a couple more chairs?
Yeah. Let's do it.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Steve. Thanks, Jake. That was a really great conversation.
Thanks.
So we're going to open it up for an in-person only conversation with Dean Bob Chen and Professor Rosalyn Negrón. And we'll take a few additional audience questions from the note cards. And then we'll also do a book signing in the back. So come on up.
Come on down.
Hey, how's it going?
Do we have some handheld mics so we can?
Oh, great.
Okay. Yeah,
Oh, we
just
might.
go over.
Okay.
This is being recorded. Where's Rebecca? Oh, you gonna join us here as well? Oh, all right. So, do either of you have specific questions? Otherwise, I have some audience questions that I'd like you to respond to.
Well, I guess maybe I just had some reflections that came up for me, and maybe some questions can come out of that. So I'll just, by way of a little bit of introduction, I'll say that the reason why I'm here is because I've done some research over the past few years looking exactly at this question of how people decide whether to leave or stay after climate-related disasters, especially in the context of Puerto Rico. So I was able to read the first 2 chapters of your book, and I found your work to be really clarifying and also sort of resonating to some of the things that we heard from the folks who we spoke to in Puerto Rico and also in Florida, where a lot of people left after Hurricane Maria in 2017. So I think, some of the things that came up for me, so I'm specifically focused on the migrants themselves or the people who are confronted with these decisions. And for me, kind of the various options in these decisions create three different categories of people that are subject to this questions of displacement in the context of climate change. There are the people who decide to stay. There are the people who are transient because they're sort of caught between a few different sets of risks and options. And then there are people who decide to leave and then resettle in different places. And what's interesting for me is that, from either from a policy perspective in terms of how civil society responds to this, that does create potentially three different sets of problems or issues. And so I'm curious to know how you think about that. One of the things that you mentioned that really resonated, particularly in the case of those who decide to stay, is this question of place-based attachment in the decision to stay. And I think you're absolutely right. Certainly we heard this in the case of Puerto Rico, that love and memory are important pieces of that. The case of Lincoln City in Kingston. Also, there's this issue of the community and the social networks that people were really reluctant to leave behind. And we certainly heard that as well. I think another part of it that has to do with risk is that there was something about the hurricanes that was more predictable in some ways for them than the potential risk of leaving. And for some people, they left, to Orlando or the parts of Florida, and they ended up with additional storms. So I think that what we heard a lot from people in terms of this question of why they were staying is also because they didn't want to start over, and the risk of that was just much more incalculable for them than the risk of confronting a future storm. And so, I wonder what you sort of heard in relation to that and what you think about that. I'll say just a couple last things. There are many people who left, and I think related to this issue of risk, there's many people who left Puerto Rico after the Hurricane Maria who were testing out sort of maybe their predictions of what the risk is like, and then they discovered that things were worse where they tried to settle than they were back home, and so many people returned. Again, because they felt like the risk was within sort of the universe of what they could cope with and that what they sort of knew, plus they had the sort of the broader context of support and all of that. And this kind of, as a final point, created a set of really, so for some people, really difficult moral dilemmas for those who chose to leave, because there was a bunch of debates about whether that was the right thing to do for the nation, whether that was the right thing to do for family, and with so many people sort of coming back and discovering that things weren't as easy as they imagined, it just made that decision to leave and try to resettle that much more fraught. So I'll just leave it there. I don't know if you want to go next or if there's anything you would like to respond, but I appreciate the conversation.
Well, perhaps you want to respond, Jake, because she's talking about the Puerto Rican case study, but you have several case studies where you may want to reflect on this observation.
Yeah, I mean, when I started working on it, I think naively I assumed that the categories were number 1 and number 3, right? You stay or you leave, and then I think that by the end, your number 2 kind of swallowed the other two. I said, well, like, it's all a shade of number 2 once you get, enough economic pressure. But I think actually, like, the interviews that I did with people who left Puerto Rico after Maria were really instructive in this, because I spoke to some people who ended up in Buffalo, ended up in Western Massachusetts, and like number 2 kind of seemed to shade into number 3 after a while, or back to number 1, as you said, right? Like, FEMA will give you housing for 18 months in a hotel or something in Amherst, and you think you're going to go back, but then, it turns out that there's a job or something, and like, people say, okay, well, Amherst is my home now, Buffalo is my home now, and then the people say, no, after 2 years, I want to go back. And I thought that was really instructive and really eye-opening, that like people's self-interpretation, their own narratives about what they're doing are often really challenged by the economic realities that they face, and then they can kind of reclaim the decision to be, okay, no, I am staying, even though I've been gone for 3 years. Oh no, actually, I'm going to leave, even though I've been going back every few months for the, I thought that was really, if I'm not mistaken, there's people from Puerto Rico who left after Maria in all 50 states and several countries, that displacement event was really, I think, like, typifying of what will happen, of just like, it's just not as simple as like staying or leaving. I'd love to learn more about that research. That sounds fascinating. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm kind of curious about moving as an entire community. So there's been a couple Native American communities in the Northwest that have been relocated on their request.
Yeah.
But it's a different context, right? It's a different ecosystem. But they do move not as an individual family or individual, but as a community. Do you know how successful those are, or do you have some guesses?
It's not in the book, but I spent a decent amount of time with the one that's been fully executed in the lower 48 states in Ile-de-Jean-Charles, Louisiana. And this was it was really discouraging, because this was, again, something that was proposed by the tribal leader in the late 1990s as a way of figuring out the fact that this island was, had lost 98% of its land mass. And by the time it was done, by the time that the state had actually gotten the money and designed the new community and talked to everybody about moving, there was just so much discord and there was so much disagreement about whether this was a good idea. And a lot of people in the meantime, while waiting for the money and waiting for the community to be built, they ended up having to leave anyway because they just kept getting flooded and they went to somewhere else. And a lot of people still say that they're never going to leave, even though, their house is 13 feet off the ground and the area around them is not drivable. It's so wet. It was like, I do think that those, it's hard to put a dollar value on community and on connection. And, you would say, people probably, we want to preserve that as we, help people move. Like, that's a really noble goal. But our first, attempt at it was basically a disaster. And it's now open. People have moved in. And I went there like a year ago, and I was shocked because this new neighborhood, right in the shadow of an equipment storage facility for Chevron. And Chevron was the company that cut up the Louisiana Bayou, and people now have to look at Chevron trucks like every day. It's just like, it's expensive, it's difficult, it's hard to arrange, and in this case, it did not work out. But I do think it's like, theoretically, it's the best outcome, because you get to keep all the things that make a community what it is. But we've got to get better at it. I don't know that much about the Pacific Northwest ones. My impression is that they're still kind of in the planning stages, and hopefully they can find a way to avoid this outcome. But yeah, a lot of the federal policymakers and state people who worked on this, they just felt really stung, because they felt like, oh man, like we tried it and it didn't work. And a lot of the tribal community, they just feel completely insulted by the way that it came out. It was highly discouraging. But yeah, like, it's going to happen again, and hopefully it's better next time. Yeah.
Think of Shishmaref, for example, in
Right.
Alaska.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
How's that working out?
Well, they've struggled to get money. There's been phase 1 has been going on for 20 years, if I'm not mistaken. And the fundamentals of it make sense, and it should work, but it's just not something, for a long time, up until the Ile-de-Jean-Charles event, I think, this was the kind of thing that, HUD would do, I think, when, this is a little bit callous, but they would do it, once they'd finished everything else that they were working on. It's like when you finish the work for the day and then you start, I'll clean up my folders or whatever. It was like that level of priority, for the federal government, and you could see that in the way that it worked out. But hopefully now, you could see a little bit more forward thinking, and the government be more present in those things, because it's, especially in the Northwest Coast, in Alaska and Washington State, that's a pretty urgent problem. There's communities that are just, there's fundamentally structurally unsound because of erosion and they need to move.
So, you have more questions? Oh, you gotta go. So it looks like the hour has approached, that we need to wrap things up here. I want to thank first Dean Chen and the professor and the author.
Thank you.
And the book is The Great Displacement, Climate Change and the Next American Migration. And seriously, folks, this is really well written, very accessible, very accessible. And because sooner or later it is going to affect either you or people you care about, both in your family and perhaps in the enterprises that you're engaged in. This is something to think about. It's an uncomfortable subject. It's kind of like death. You know, we really don't like to talk or think about the inevitability of life. But this is coming. We have set off this process of climate disruption. And even if we were to stop emitting CO2 this afternoon, it's a flywheel. It's just going to keep rolling forward right now. And we're just seeing, by the way, the beginning effects of this flywheel. So we can have a good outcome or we can have a less good outcome. Is that the,
Yeah.
I'll give you the final word here.
That's definitely the case. Yeah, there's still, it's very much a live ball in every sense and in every aspect. That's kind of like the main conclusion of any reporting on any aspect of the topic is it's really up in the air.
So we have choices. Thank you for coming.
Yeah. Thanks.
Very good, thank you. Thanks, Bob. Much appreciated.
Thanks so much.
Pleasure, Steve.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Pleasure.
Do you have a card or email or something?
Oh, God, I